morning, good day. Welcome everyone to our continuation, our Sunday morning Bible class. We're continuing to study in the book of Judges. And we will be in lesson number 11 for today and do lesson number 12 next week. And that'll round out our study for the quarter. Before we begin, though, let's start with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for every way that you've been mindful of us, the life and health that we enjoy, for this opportunity that you put before us to assemble here in peace and in quiet. Consider things from your word, the things that your Spirit has preserved for us, the things that you would have us to know about your people's history, about you, and how you've exercised your plan throughout the machinations of mankind's history to bring your Savior to earth and to eliminate the enmity between us so that we could be adopted children and call you Father. We pray, Father, that we will keep sight of these things as we study from your word, consider these difficult passages. Help us to understand them in the way that you intended, be considerate of each other as we struggle with them, but also to keep our minds on the big picture and how having this information prepares us for a life of service to you and for the life beyond this one. We're aware of many of our members that may be traveling, may be sick, may be hindered from being able to assemble with us. We ask that you would correct those circumstances in their life and they would be able to return to our number and our work and worship together. As always, Father, we pray that we'll be pleasing in your sight, and then in the end, if we've been found faithful, that you will, by your grace, give us a home in heaven with you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. This is a difficult time. These last chapters, chapter 18 to the end of the book of Judges, aren't given very specific times, but they are, if you may notice that several times that there this phrase about, in those days there was no king in the land, and every man did what was right in his own heart. Now, this is not because of some shortcoming that God made, that God planned that, I gave the people this law and I didn't give them any way to govern themselves, or that somehow or another that this was some kind of a blind spot. But as God will remind Samuel in the next book, that is the book of Samuel, when the people start asking for a king, they're not rejecting Samuel. They're not rejecting the system of judges and deliverers. They're rejecting God as their king. God is their king. And when they're asking for a king, they are liminally or subliminally, they're in a maybe not so subtle way, but they're basically saying, we don't like the leadership. We don't like having to be dependent upon God. Matter of fact, the first reason that the people began asking for a king to Samuel is that we need somebody to lead us into battle. And this is again kind of a machination. It's a rationalization of the human beings that says, having God's protection, God withdraws his protection when we serve idols. When we do what we want to do, God's not there to protect us. So we need some protection of our own. We need to improve on this system so that we're not completely dependent upon God for our deliverance and protection. Now, they might not, if you run that up on the banner and you wave that and say, everybody, I want you to sign a petition here, say you don't want to be dependent upon God and you want your own protection. You want to rebel against God. They probably couldn't get very many people to sign the petition. But that's subliminally. That's behind the scenes. That's really what they're asking for. And it's this period really between Samson and the last judges that God provided and this advent of them coming up with this idea to be like the nations around them and to ask for a king that these stories come from. Now, this has been about 350 years. And we've got in our mind that, Old Testament people live a long time. And some of them did. Okay? Noah was many hundred years old when he built the ark, and he lived for quite a while after that. Abraham lived to about, if I'm recalling this correctly, 185 years. Moses, who, this is about 350 years before this, was 120 years old when God took him, when God ended his life and took him into his reward. This is the time, and just a few generations, a few decades after this, we're going to get into where they have kings. And during the time of David wrote in the Psalms that man's years were 70 years. So these people live lives about as long as I think globally life expectancy is something like 78 years for the world right now. And so these people kind of live in that period of time. And you're saying, what's this got to do with the lesson here? Hang on, I'm getting there. We count a generation every 25 years, right? We say that that's how we count generations. Does that ring a bell? How many generations are we talking about in 350 years then? 14-ish? Since the time of Joshua, the greatest generation, the conquering generation that came into the land, the children, the people that grew up out of slavery. They were born on the way to Canaan and witnessed God providing for them every day and the signs and wonders, and saw all their parents die before they got there. That's that generation. We're about 14 generations removed. And the reason this long, rambling, roundabout way of saying that these people, how did these people get to this state? Well, it took some time. And we've been studying for the past 10 weeks about what was going on during that time. And during that time, we've seen, as God prophesied within the book, as God described within the book, that their decline, the decline that he described. That they would have this ebb and flow of times of prosperity and deliverance and blessings from God. They would fall away from God. They would begin to serve idols. They would become more and more like the people that they dispossessed, that they came to the land to exterminate. And really, the fact of the matter is, I think we could be charitable and say they had mixed results in following that plan. They didn't really follow it to God's in the manner that God intended. And that's how you get this. We got kind of this kind of snarky way, if you want to have heathen people, this is how you get heathen people. You live among heathen people and start behaving like them, you get to be heathen people. You want to be a heathen nation? This is how you get to be a heathen nation. But we find even in this particular narrative, the beginning that we see at the beginning in Judges chapter 17, we find that they still like to call upon the name of the Lord. They still liked their identity as the Lord's people, and still gave some heed, like it's a talisman, or this impugns the motives of this people. And I'm really trying to read the story of Micah without trying to paint him out to be a wicked person, or I'm trying to look at it in the best possible light. And it could be that Micah is literally doing the very best that he can. And he knows something, he and his family know something about the law. They know something about what they ought to do. But it's either deliberately polluted information, or Micah has intervened and tried to negotiate something that's in between what the law requires and what he wants to do. Those are possibilities. But being as charitable, being as looking on as favorably as possible to the narrative, it may be because Micah and his family weren't taught any better. Who was responsible for teaching the law to each successive generation? Who's the primary responsibility? Who's the one that we should go to when we find ignorance of the law as a problem? The priests. The priests are certainly in line. And they've been given the charge on a large scale. But in your family, who's responsible for teaching you the law?
The father.
Your daddy. Now, if your daddy's ignorant and he's a heathen, you got problems. What you'll learn about the law, what you'll learn about God is not going to be too good. But how did he get to be ignorant heathen? His dad. Number one, his dad. Again, I'm going to put the head of the household in the primary, in the path, in the first place in the critical path. That's the first place that it broke down. And then secondarily, the priesthood. The priests were responsible for teaching the law. If you wanted to know about the law, where could you find a priest? Not yet. There's not a temple yet, right? But the portable temple that ended up at Shiloh. That's one place that you could go. Also, you could go to maybe one of the cities of the Levites. Because after all, that's where the people that the cities were spread out. There were 48 of them. And they weren't given, they were we'll get to what's maybe broken about that a little later. But that might be a place that you go. There were outlets. You didn't have to live in ignorance, unless you wanted to, or you liked to, or you trusted in the teaching that your dad gave. But that's how you get to this particular. That's how we get to this particular spot. I did want to touch also before we go on. There's a great at the top of page 46. There's a great comparison, I think, comparing Samson's life to the history of Israel with respect to things like prophetic selection. Samson was announced beforehand to his parents, and God announced His plan to Abraham about making his seed a great nation and blessing the entire world through his seed. So we do have this prophetic selection. The dedication and unique characteristic, well, a lot of the law was to keep them at arm's length from the practices of people around them who were not God worshipers, who invented their own gods. They worshiped false gods. They were wicked and were exceedingly wicked people to the point that God would even want to exterminate them. God didn't want His people to be like that, so He set up a system of laws and beliefs and practices for them to stay at arm's length of that involved the kind of fabrics that they wore, the kind of food that they could eat, their behavior to each other, their economy, how they administered justice. God set all of that up as part of the law. The law touched the life of an adult Hebrew in every day and every way. God made a provision for that. God also, occasionally we see greatness. Occasionally we see where they're a stellar nation. And nations around them hear about them and fear of them because of the great work that God works between them. And we see that in Samson's life too. The Philistines lived in dread of Samson for good reason. Samson was decimating their populations and their economies and their cities. Also, the comparison to frequent weaknesses and defeat. And Samson, despite given all these advantages by God, occasionally made boneheaded, terrible decisions with severe personal consequences. These periods of greatness followed by these frequent weaknesses and defeat, and eventual destruction with blessing. Is that even when Samson is taking his own life, he kills more Philistines in one sitting by taking his life than he did in the entire lifetime. And that's a pretty good feat. That's pretty amazing. But we see a lot of good parallels there, and I thought the author was really shrewd in drawing that attention. And it's not just laid out here scripturally by outline, but if you happen to be thinking along those lines, you can see those parallels, I think, pretty easily. And that's another point that we want to make here. And this is one of those periods of great fall. Let's now talk a little bit about Micah. Who is Micah? Where's Micah from? Most likely. Ephraim. He lives in the hill country of Ephraim. These lands that were allotted to the children of Israel, the tribes of Jacob, those were an inheritance. That was the land for them to use and for them to live on and to provide for themselves. You didn't have to live on your tribe's land, but most people did. Matter of fact, the guy that we see a little later on, who's introduced to us here at the end of chapter 17, he's a stranger in a strange land. He's not living in the allotment that his family was part of their inheritance. So Micah has his household. He's living in the hill country of Ephraim, and as the story opens here, what's his confession to his mom? Okay. So, what does that? This is not putting your best foot forward, I guess. This is if you start out a study saying, "Oh, Mom, you know that 1,100 pieces of silver that you lost? Well, I took it. You didn't lose it. I just had it without your permission." Or, I don't know how he tried to explain that. This would be a difficult thing to explain. But I admire Micah for wanting to come clean, have a clear conscience. The 1,100 pieces of silver is the price that Delilah extracted from the Philistine lords, if you recall, for betraying Samson. Each one of the lords paid that. And for this amount to show up here right after the account of Samson is just kind of suspicious to me. I wonder if it's maybe the maximum amount of an inheritance. Maybe, it could be completely a coincidence that this 1,100 pieces of silver are showing up and Samson's account and in Micah's account. It could just be a wild coincidence, but it may have been kind of a heathen practice of this when you were doling out your inheritance as such. The maximum amount that you could give to any one of them that anyone could expect was this 1,100 pieces of silver. And maybe Micah was just taking it in advance, not thinking his mom would live out the year, or wanting it like the prodigal son to go ahead and use it for whatever he wanted to. But he comes clean here. He confesses here that he took it. And the mother blesses him, says, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." And so she's happy not only to get her money back, to have what was lost found, but she's also appreciative of the effort that Micah made in returning it to her, and that result of his conscience. He returns the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mom, and what does she decide to do with it?
Make images.
Several of you jumped out. What?
Give it to the Lord to make it.
Okay, she says that she's going to give it to the Lord, and that's fantastic. That's terrific. Jack?
She took 200 and made a great image.
Okay, but she then gives this. She doesn't give it all. She doesn't dedicate it all. But among the portion that she's given to the Lord, she gives those 200 pieces to Micah. And what's her wishes and what becomes of the 1,100 pieces of silver? Okay, in verse 4, his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave them to the silversmith, who made them into the graven image and a molten image as they were in the house of Micah. So she gives this money to Micah, or ostensibly on his behalf, but it ends up, and probably by her direction, ends up at the silversmith where she makes this graven image. What did they do with the graven image?
Just said it was in Micah's house.
Okay, Micah sets it up in his house along with the ephods, and it mentions here in verse 6, and household idols, and consecrated one of his sons that he may become his priest. And so they began worshiping this image as though it's God's. Red flags, isn't it? I mean, doesn't that make you wait a minute? I thought these people honored the Lord. I thought they were descendants of Jacob, descendants of Abraham, and honored Jehovah, whose very first commandment said that you don't do stuff like this. That this is not the way that he wants to be honored. I'm really struggling to see how their mind works. How do they make sense of this? Except for the fact that if you start again with Micah understanding and maybe remembering things that his dad taught him, or maybe going to another city and hearing some teaching about the Lord, but he's got the top 10%, or just the veneer of what it means to be the people of God. His understanding of what pleases God is woefully incomplete if he's doing all this to please God. Now, it may be this. I can't help when I read this story, I thought about the golden calf. You know, what was the when the children of Israel were at Mount Sinai and Moses had been away for a while and they went to Abraham and made a request. What was the request?
Make us a God we could worship.
Make us a God a God to worship for delivering us from Egypt. They were worshiping this calf as though it were the God that delivered them from Egypt. And in fact, that was Jehovah God. That was the make no graven image in my name God. And of course, Aaron offers the lamest lie in the history of mankind, at least in the top 10. That I just threw all the gold in here and it came out a calf. Who knows? And I know they live in supernatural times. They've been supernaturally delivered from Egypt. But come on, that's strange credulity for even a child. But nonetheless, it's flying under the banner of saying we're worshiping God by doing this. We're setting this image up. And it looks like Micah intends to try to worship the Lord. And he fails at every single instance. Doesn't he? Does he do anything correctly or by the law? Caleb?
his law is his own. I think verse 6 is the key. He does what's right in his own eyes. So it's generous to suggest maybe he's trying to worship the Lord, but I think verse 6 is what they very intentionally say they're not really concerned.
That's cut right to the chase. That's the reason why I think we're getting this reminder of the kind of times that they're living in. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. This is a descendant of Abraham. This is one of the descendants of Joseph. Right? How did they get to this point? Well, the passage of time and living in a heathen culture that was supposed to have been eliminated, that they were not supposed to have been exposed to. And that part of the reason that God didn't prod them to complete his instructions was, as said in chapter 2 and 3 of Judges, is I'm going to use these heathen people to test my people and see if they really love me. I'm going to use them and I'm going to test them for this purpose. And historically, their scorecard doesn't look too good. You know, did you used to get, progress reports maybe when you were in school? And maybe you dreaded taking them home? Or maybe you were really excited about taking them home, but really it's kind of a warts and all, it'd say, well, does good work in class, but goofs off too much, or talks too much and distracts others. You maybe saw stuff like that. I don't know, maybe you were a much better student than I was. But that's the kind of stuff that would show up here. And if we're looking at the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, the descendant of Jacob's scorecard, or progress report at this point, it doesn't look very good. And so that's why we're reading practically a pagan story about a guy that did what was right in his own eyes. He knew something about the Lord, and he knew something about how he ought to serve him, because it mentioned about the ephods, and it mentioned that he needs someone to administer, someone to as a go-between, that type of person that in verse 5, consecrating, and he consecrated one of his sons. He sets one of his sons up to be the priest for the family in his household church. And again, credit that he wants at some point, at some way, that he wants to serve the Lord, but he's making missteps literally at every step of the plan. Joe?
And if you look at the very last verse in Judges, it's that same line. In those days there was no king, everyone did what's right in their own eyes. And it seems that the entire book of Judges is a display of those who actually serve the Lord, and success is granted, and then those who operate outside the Lord's guidelines. And you said it, the loving the Lord. The Bible says, if you love me, you keep my commandments. Clearly, God showed a picture here of those who love God as compared to those who...
See, you should wish that Joe was teaching class, because his introduction was much shorter than mine. He described what I was trying to in my introduction with much fewer words, but we're on the same page. I just got there a real roundabout kind of way. But that's the reason why this phrase is poked in here. And it's not just that we don't have Saul of Benjamin as our king. It's not just that we don't have a warrior that has been somebody that can lead us into battle as our king. When it says that there was no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, that means that they weren't seeking God. And we don't like to see that. These are God's chosen people, right? This is the one for whom all the nations of the earth is going to be blessed. They're the ones that God's operating his plan to. We don't like to read that they're off the rails. We don't like to read that they're wicked and heathen people. These are God's chosen people. And we want to find a way of dressing up whatever the scriptures say about them in the best possible light. But it's really hard to do right now because they are really and truly off the rails. They are way outside the program. Gene?
From the very beginning, through their wanderings, everything was visual to them. They had things they had to do. They had sacrifices. They had to worship God. They had to do something, and everything was visual. So that's kind of where this is coming to the head here is they got to have something to look at. They have no spiritual thoughts about this. Everything is touchy-feely or look at. And that, Samson, that was his problem through here.
Good
His
example.
eyes were his problem, so.
His eyes were his problem. And that's a good characteristic. Their religion was kind of skin deep. They didn't recognize that there was a spiritual significance to these sacrifices and these feasts and these rules. They missed that point entirely. And again, I'm going to have to put at least some of the blame at that at the feet of the priests, who didn't get that point across. They were responsible for teaching the people, but if the people were ignorant and failing in their understanding, at least some of that has to go back on the priest. And God, much later in their history, calls that out. Thomas?
I like that you brought up this lack of knowledge that we've identified here that's going from generation to generation. And I think that, with Micah, that becomes apparent because, he does what he does, and he sets up something, as you said, with kind of the right intention. He wants to serve God, but he doesn't really know how. He doesn't know the right way. He's got some ideas, like, setting up a priest and stuff like that. So he's clearly got some bits and pieces of what he needs to know, but he lacks the knowledge to truly do what he needs to. And so in that lack of knowledge, what replaces that is the corrupting influence of the pagan nations around them. Right? If you don't have the knowledge to rely on, you're just going to default to whatever's in your environment around you, which is a bad or corrupting influence in this case.
And this is a human tendency. And at the end of the day, among every way, however you may look at the chosen people of God, they are first and foremost humans. And they are not immune to anything in any condition. And their history is replete with that. Yes, sir.
Just to push back, if I may, on the ignorance issue, because I don't think it's ignorance at all here. God has given mankind the power of choice for a reason. And that power of choice is if we choose the right way, then God knows we love him because we made the right choice. We can see through the story of Micah that he sought out a Levite, a priest, that he paid 10,000 shekels for the sole purpose of endorsing his new little ephod and shrine of silver and gold calves or whatever that it is that he made. So, and I think the whole book of Judges, especially the last 4 chapters, isn't really about the ignorance so much as it is the willingness to disobey, to use the lack of ignorance as an excuse.
And there's certainly equal opportunities for both those point of views. And they knew something about God. What you could observe without the law, without someone who is skilled in the law, to tell you about God, to tell you that you ought to follow the rules in the Old Testament law, you couldn't observe that. That was not birth knowledge. You couldn't just come to those conclusions on your own. You had to have a teacher. But God set up a system that, if it worked the way it was supposed to, would ensure. He ensured that at least 3 times a year, all the adult males in the nation had to come before him at the tent of assembly, the tabernacle. He ensured that was built into the law. So to be abject, to be completely ignorant of the law, is you had to put some effort into that. That if you followed God's system in the way that it was supposed to, and you made the sacrifices, you made the pilgrimage to keep the feast, you did those sort of things. Those were all built in to ensure that you would stay on track. And that system has failed. That system is broken down, as we're about to get into. Because now we find this Levite, and where is he living? Is he living in one of the Levite cities, the 48 cities that the tribe of Levi was afforded for their inheritance?
No, he's living in this man's house.
No, not yet. In verse 7 is a young man from Bethlehem in Judah. So we've got a Levite who was probably, his father was from the tribe of Levi, and his mother was from Judah, and thus he would be entitled to live in Bethlehem. But what's he doing living in Bethlehem? Maybe he just likes the weather. It's entirely possible. He just likes there. He likes his mom's side of the family better than his dad's. It could also be an indication of the fact that if the Levite system, the Levitical system, has broken down, that the Levites are having to fend for themselves, and that they can't make a living in the cities that they were afforded. Their cities were, each of these, they were 1,000 cubits on a side, which mathematically, if I did all my math right, is about 210 acres allotted for them for these cities. There were 48 of them spread out on both sides of the Jordan, with 6 of those being cities of refuge. 3 on the east side and 3 on the west side of Jordan. Bethlehem was not among the cities of Levi. Bethlehem is in Benjamin, actually. But he's from Judah, but he's living, Bethlehem's just over the border of Judah and Benjamin, according to at least the maps that we have in our study. So the Levi isn't living in one of the Levitical cities is a red flag. That's certainly telling us something is wrong with this. And he decides to leave there, and he makes his journey and gets into the hill country of Ephraim and encounters Micah. And Micah finds out, I guess, having a discussion with him here, says, and he leads off in verse 9, I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to stay wherever I may find a place. Well, as it turns out, Micah has a stand-in for his priest, and now he's getting closer to the real thing. So he knows at least enough about the law to know that a Levite trumps your eldest son, or your consecrated son. It doesn't say he's his eldest son. But a Levite, no matter whatever virtues that Micah's son had as being the priest for the family, a Levite is higher, more authority, is better. And so he hires him. He says, I'm looking for a place. I'm going to stay wherever I may find a place. And Micah says, well, stay with me and be a father and priest to me, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a suit of clothes, and your maintenance. So the Levi went in. He agreed to live with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. So Micah extends every courtesy to this Levite in setting up his household worship. Again, I think that this Levite is available for hire. I don't know that he was available for hire. He was just it says he's looking for another place to live. But that he's not living in the city that is part of his inheritance suggests to me that something else is broken, something else about the worship of God. And some of the Levites, as a result of by the law, would receive some of their sustenance from some of the sacrifices that were made. That was at least one avenue for them to. That's the reason that they didn't have ostensibly a land that they would rely on for their sustenance, except for the surrounding area around the walled cities, where they could have fields and such. But they were intended to live off of the law to some way. You know, there were 4 families in Levi, in the tribe of Levi, and they were each apportioned a number of these cities, and they were spread out all over all the tribes. And so there was a pretty liberal application of Levites living within each one of the tribes that God afforded them. This is kind of interesting because it goes out all the way back to Isaac's blessing, or rather Jacob's blessings of his sons. When to Levi and Simeon, he says, I will scatter you among your brethren, in Genesis 49. And that's exactly when the tribe of Simeon kind of gets absorbed very early on. You don't see much mention of it even in this period, absorbed very early on into Judah. And in fact, Levi was deliberately spread out among all the other tribes through these cities, even though that and to remind you, again, I think Glenn reminded us, is that God took Levi. He took Levi as ransom for the firstborn. The terms of their agreement with God is the firstborn of everything. Even your children belongs to me. And after Levi demonstrates the fealty to God, when they go with Moses and go from one end of the camp to the other, slaughtering the people that are worshiping the golden calf, God gives them credit for that, for their zeal for him, and takes them as a ransom for the people as they were numbered. And so that was part of their Old Testament history. And as a result of him taking them in place of all the firstborn, they belonged to him, and they were dependent upon God, not the milk and honey in the land for their sustenance. And part of that was all built into the law. And if that broke down, if that's not being followed, well, you get this kind of situation. You get this kind of where people are inventing stuff, making stuff up as they go, and just trying to find a way to get by. So the stage is set here for the hill country of Ephraim. Meanwhile, on the coast, what's going on with the tribe of Dan? That is showing up in this section of the book would probably be a good hint that it's not too good. Okay.
They're looking for a home.
Earlier in the book, it indicated that Dan was suffering because the Philistines, the Amorites, would not allow them into the valley. They chased them out of the valley into the hill country. So they moved them east further in and took about half of their territory, if I understand it correctly. As a matter of fact, you may recall in the Song of Deborah, and when they made the call out to gather the tribes to be able to fight, that what she says about Dan is that Dan played with the ships, or Dan remained on the ships. And so at that time, this may be during the time of Barak and Deborah, may have been before, while Dan still controlled the territory from the hill country to the shore of the Mediterranean. So they were dabbling in ships at that time, I think, from this song. But in that time, and that's now a couple of hundred years, they lost this territory. And so they're living on a much smaller plot of land than they initially were entitled to, and began to seek better fortunes. And so what did they do?
They sent some men in to sort of spy out this area and see what it looked like.
Try to find us a place to migrate to. We want to migrate. We're going to leave here. Our lot in life is this worsening over time. So we want to leave this place, even though it's in the inheritance that God gave us. We want to leave this place and negotiate it. We're going to find someplace new. I know God gave us, and we're supposed to be appreciative and all that, but we want something better than what God's allotted us, and so we're going to take matters into our own hand and find someplace new to live. And so they sent out scouts. That's good precedent. That's something that's been done. It's what children of Israel did before they came into the land. It's what they did before they attacked Jericho. It's a valid tactic. And so these 5 scouts, as they began to search around, they go north in the hill country and arrive in Ephraim and arrive at Micah's house. Then what?
I find it interesting they recognize the voice of the Levite.
I don't know that they knew him from before, but they maybe recognized him, overheard him conducting some kind of service in his appointed duties, and that's what they recognized. Because it doesn't actually name this guy from Levi from the tribe of Levi at any point in the book, unless it does it at the very end, and that's something we'll get to hopefully. But anyway, they recognized what was going on. And they said, this looks like this is something we should have. We should get us some of this. Yes, sir.
It identifies him as the family of Judah in verse 7. So
Yes.
while he was a Levite, he was not of the lineage of Aaron, so he could not serve as a priest.
That's exactly true.
And so that's just sort of
Or
But they found a good excuse to make him a priest.
in verse 7, you said verse 7 or verse 10?
Yeah, 17 verse 7.
And that's where I'm not. 17 verse 7, as a Levite, to call him, he's a mixed lineage, and that he's called a Levite may have been because his father was the Levite and his mother was the Judah. But even so, as not being from the descendant of Aaron, a Levite, all priests were from the tribe of Levi, right? So all priests were Levites by genealogy, but only the descendants of Aaron could actually serve as priest.
Correct.
And those were the rules. And this was not one of those guys. He was among Aaron's other 3. He was a descendant of Aaron's other 3 brothers. I believe is what the record is telling us here. And so anyway, but he knows enough about how to conduct what the training that he got as his exposure as a Levi to be able to conduct something that the Danites recognized as being God's service. And what's the Danite assessment here? I've already said they decide they want that. This would be a good thing for us to have. And so that says something about the scarcity of actual knowledgeable priestly type people, even in the tribe of Dan as well. Ephraim's not the only one that's doing it without, but probably the tribe of Dan as well. But they decide that, having God on our side in this venture would be a pretty good thing. And so what did they do?
They asked that priest to inquire of God if the things that they were going to do was going to succeed or not. Is this conquest going to succeed?
And the priest comes right back with a reply, it looks like. And he says, "Go in peace. The way in which you are going has the Lord's approval." That maybe is exactly correct. But again, these are wicked times. And the priest, this priest, or this person that's acting as a priest, is likely unqualified to be a priest and may not actually have a connection to God at all. He might also be about one of those people that was doing what was right in his own heart and telling them what he thought would be a good thing, or at least that they wanted to hear. And so they take that as the marching orders, and they go up and they find a village. North, it's far north, at the north end of Israel's territory. And this village, Laish, is a colony of Sidonians. They're living in the manner of the Sidonians. The Sidonians, most of them live on the coast, but these people broke off from those people and found a place where they could live in peace. And apparently conducting not a trouble to anyone around them. They were just living their lives and making do for themselves. But how did the men of Dan view them? Easy pickings. Looks like these are peaceable people. They're not trying to hurt anybody or get in anybody's way. We can take them. And so they came back to their folks, the scouts that came back and made the report. And their folks said, sounds like a new home. And so the Danites left en masse, marching to Laish. Along the way, though, they stop at Micah's. And it wasn't just for refreshment. They're recruiting for their new village. And they make an offer that the Levite there doesn't refuse. I don't know that he can't refuse. You made a point. We all have choices. This was a decidedly better offer. I don't know that the Levite was in the market. I don't know that he was looking to improve his circumstances, because he had things much better than he did when he was living in Bethlehem. And so he's living a pretty good life, is to be in the household priest for this guy that's got another at least 900 pieces of silver in the household. And he's getting a nice salary in his clothes and his maintenance, and he's treated like one of Micah's sons. I mean, really, how much better could life get? But nonetheless, he's intrigued to go along with these Danites, and so they set out with as 6 says in verse 11, 600 men armed with weapons of war that set up. They went out and they camped west of Kiriath Jearim in Judah, and then passed from there in the hill country, the house of Micah. They take the men armed with weapons in verse 16 by the entrance's gate, but then the 5 spies take the offer into to the Levite, the wandering Levite, and make this offer to him. But they also abscond with all the goodies, all the molten image that was formed, and the ephod, and the trappings that they need, because after all, the priest needs all those things too. So they are, again, if you're thinking, well, these men are being moved by the Word of God. They sought out the Word of God the first opportunity they had, and they're seeking God's direction and what they ought to do. They're not doing a very good job of it, in my estimation. And they're really acting just like the rest of the people who are doing what's right, what seems right to them. They're pursuing what they want. That's at the top of their list, to me. And we see them acting just like people that are pursuing their own interests. How do they fare against the tribe of Laish? Well, if they call the place Dan now, that's a good hint, right? They were able to drive those people out, those people that were peaceful and not seeking be a problem to anyone or to cause anyone any problems. They drove those people out. And they found it says, I think elsewhere, and I think even in the book of Joshua, that they found another village. This is alluded to in more than one place here. It's alluded to at the beginning of the book of Judges, as well as and the book of Joshua. And in fact, that they ended up finding another place to live peaceably and not cause problems for people, or not seeking any difficulties. So they've, and I should say, Micah goes out and confronts them. Micah discovers there, he takes a party out and catches up to them and demands restitution, and isn't satisfied. He looks around and sees 600 men armed with armed for battle, and he and his family are not. I mean, they basically the men of Dan have a bigger stick, and the men of Dan, their will prevails. Just like the heathen nations. That's exactly the way heathen nations are governed. That's exactly the way that they govern relationships between them. The 5 lords of the Philistines, they lived in kind of a loose confederacy, but they were constantly bickering and battling with each other, and generally whoever had the biggest stick won. And that's exactly what happens here. It's not Micah is trying to serve the Lord, and he wants to serve the Lord harder than the men of Dan does. That's got nothing to do with it. He's simply badly outnumbered at this point and has to let the men of Dan have their way. So basically, it says no one to deliver them because it was for the men of Lachish, and then they rebuilt the city and lived in it. They called the name of the formerly is Laish in verse 29. And they called Dan, and the sons of Dan set up for them the graven image. And then this name that pops up: Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of, your version probably says Manasseh. There's a footnote in my version that says Moses. And in fact, Moses did have a son. It was named Gershom, and he was a Levite. He wasn't from Aaron's family. Of course, being the son of Moses make him at least a partial Levite. Because, remember, Moses married Reuben's daughter. And so it would have been a mixed genealogy, mixed heathen and Levite. But as a Levite, he has some credentials, but he's still not a priest. He's not entitled under the law to be a priest. But yet, that's the guy that they set up, and his sons after him, to be the Levite, be their captive Levite. And continue Micah's idol worship in the name of the Lord. Not a pretty sight. It's hard not to really be discouraged by this. But again, these are human beings. They're not exempt from the human condition, and they're struggling. They're losing ground in a big way. And so we continue to see this decline of the nation in terms of their spiritual conditions, their spiritual pursuit of God. More next week. Don't be, if you, kind of looking ahead, if you think this is bad, you may not have seen anything yet. You think this is rock bottom, and the narrator turns out it's not. So that'll be next week, though.